Do you find yourself struggling to hold slopers? Well, it might be that you are making one of these 3 mistakes. Today, we've got Aiden, our resident sloper expert, to talk us through the biggest mistakes we see when holding slopers.
The number one biggest mistake we see when people are trying to hold slopers is putting their body position in the wrong place and losing core tension.
So what Aiden means here, generally with slopers, is staying low on them and staying close into the wall. So they're probably the most unforgiving hold when it comes to body position, because pulling hard on them doesn't necessarily make them any better. So I've got a pretty big round sloper here. Now generally this is actually quite good, loads of surface area, but I'm going to show you how the direction of pull and where our weight is on the wall is going to make a massive difference to how well it holds onto the hold. So if I wrap it around here, put it on the sloper, and I keep this resistance band into the wall, doesn't matter how hard I pull, it's going to stay on. But if this comes out from the wall, it slides off just the smallest amount. And again, if we look at the orientation of this sloper, it's pointing in this direction. This is where we think our force should be applied. If I put it on here again and I bring my weight over this way, it's more likely to slide off again.
So a good example of this is on this climb. Although we wanted to get to this hold, we're going to be using this hold to keep our centre of gravity in the opposing direction to the next hold, and use this to pull our hips down and into the wall. And then once we've hit this next hold, we're going to put our heel up on here and use this to pull our hips even further across, so that we can move up to this next hold.
So as Aiden said, he's going to be putting a heel hook on this hold to be able to make the move up and keep low on this hold. So that's body positioning, which was our first point. We want to keep our body into the wall as well, like we showed you with that ferroband being pulled into the wall. And this brings us to our second point, which is about maintaining core tension, which is going to keep us low on the hold. So we can have slight bend arms, that's fine, but we need to keep our hips and our legs working to keep us into the wall, and that's core tension, our second point. You may have heard people say when doing a big move to an edge or a crimp that you should aim past the hold. And this can be a good tactic for making sure that you make the distance when doing big moves. However, with slopers, Aiden is telling us that we need to make sure that we don't go too high on them, because if we catch them in a high position, it means our hips and our arms might be too bent to actually get good perch on a sloper. So make sure we're even more accurate when it comes to hitting slopers.
So this yellow is a perfect example of what Josh was just talking about, where you want to hit the hold pretty low with your hips still sucked into the wall. And if you overshoot it with a bent arm, it's going to be way harder to hold and move around.
The second really big mistake with slopers is not getting the most out of the friction. I mean, look at this thing. It is filthy. It is covered in chalk. So the first tip when it comes to friction is brushing your holds and getting all this chalk off so that you release some of that chalk and get the friction back on the holds.
A lot of people think the t-shirt slap is a bit of a showboating, but it's actually really useful to get the excess chalk off it and get that friction back.
Now that we've got the holds ready by doing our brushing, it's important to make sure that your hands have a decent amount of chalk on for the friction. So here I've got a boulder bucket with loose chalk in, and that's really excellent for getting full coverage, particularly on the palms. And then to go even more sort of detailed into the chalk, we're going to go with liquid chalk. This is really good for getting full coverage and particularly sort of like drying out the skin, cooling it down as well if it's got any alcohol content. It's pretty harsh stuff, so I might only use it a few times in a session with my skin. Maybe other people have skin that's a bit easier to do it more frequently, but just go careful and see how this works for you. Just make sure that your hands are properly chalked if you're going to be using slopers, because they are the worst forgiving when it comes to the friction you need on them, comparing them to stuff like crimps or in-cut edges. Mistake number 3 is not experimenting or being creative with how you can hold slopers. So there's actually a few different ways. There's our big open-handed, as much friction as we can get onto the sloper. And then the other side of that might literally be full crimping, sort of ripples in a sloper. We'll typically see people trying to crimp slopers when they've got poor open hand strength. So I would suggest these people try to use open hand more and see if they can become more comfortable with that. But right behind me, we've got an example of a sloper where we're actually going to be holding more of a half crimp position so that we apply more tension or more pressure through just the tips of our fingers when we can find little depressions or ripples within a sloper. So in this example of a sloper, you'll see these little divots, and actually if we just go for the typical open hand slap, it can be quite hard to hold, particularly because as those ripples bump in, we're going to lose any surface area or friction on our hand in those ripples. So here, I might be trying to line up on a particular area, and like I said, trying to get more of a crimp grip and trying to line up in one of these divots and trying to find the best place for it and applying most of the pressure just through my fingertips. This is another example here where we don't actually have any obvious features here, but when we feel it, we can subtly pick out this kind of lip or this ripple along the sloper where I want to be getting all 4 fingertips kind of lined up on this. So rather than holding it open like this, or like here where I might only get 2 fingertips on, I'm gonna bring all fingertips in line. And then like Aiden mentioned earlier of the pinching, I'm gonna get that pinch, and that's gonna be the best grip position for me on this sloper.
So although hip positioning is really important, it can only go so far. And sometimes it's really important to get the thumb involved in slopers, so you can put more weight through the hold, and also it'll help with pushing downwards to help you go upwards to the next hold. This orange is a perfect example where using thumbs makes these slopers so much better. Pretty much every one of these slopers requires you to use your thumbs, no matter where you put your hips.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget that me and Aiden did a video on our top 5 training tips for indoor climbing, so check that out over here. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.